Okay, and you're live.
Good afternoon. This is Leslie Breland with Gulf Specimen Marine Lab and Aquarium here in Panacea, Florida. And our able camera person, Allison Chin, who's helping me, and one of our summer interns, Samantha. So we are very, very happy to have you. And thank you so much, those of you who did the Instagram poll concerning the time. I know we've changed the time on you a number of times, and we've gone from 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and now we're at 2 o'clock. But for those of you who've kept up, we really do appreciate it. And that was the winning hour, early afternoon. So please know that our topic for today is sponges. And I love sponges. They are so different than all the other living things that you find in the marine environment, and they are different largely because they are so primitive. Sponges have been around for, some books say 650 million years, some books only say 550 million years, but longer than any of the other living animals on the planet. And basically, sponges are just little filtering machines. They're a bunch of little channels where the water filters through, and they feed on really, really tiny stuff that you can't even see with a microscope. Big molecules, minuscule bacteria, things that, unless you happen to have an electron microscope, are not going to be visible at all. And some of them feed on slightly larger stuff. Some of them in the deep sea even have ways of capturing things like copepods, which is very unusual. But for the most part, they just filter the water and screen out all of this tiny, tiny, tiny material as their food source. Sponges come in many, many different sizes and shapes, and all of them have this wonderful filtering channel system that allows them to take in water through tiny, tiny, tiny little holes. And then the water passes out through bigger holes. And I don't know if they're going to be able to see on camera. I'm going to use this preserved specimen here, but you can maybe see their tiny, tiny, tiny little holes all over the body of this sponge skeleton. And then there are little clusters of larger openings where the water would come out. And the same is true of all sponges. They have these tiny, tiny, tiny little openings, and then larger openings where the water comes out. So the tiny openings are called ostia. The water goes in the ostia and out the oscula. That's the larger openings. Sometimes those larger openings are really obvious. Sometimes they're not. Okay, I'm gonna move this little guy. I have, this is a sponge crab who likes to trim up a sponge and turn it into like a little hat that he can wear. And this one, I'm picking on him because this one has, the whole body of the sponge is covered in these tiny, tiny little openings where the water is coming in, and then it's exiting only through a couple of these big openings. And so that makes it very efficient. They can filter like 300 gallons of water every half hour or so. Here's the little crab who carefully trims out all of this little stuff, and then he hangs on to the sponge with his back legs. I'm going to turn him back over so he feels hidden and secure. Sponges are often involved in commensal relationships because they have all those little holes. They make great hiding places for tiny little animals. This little tray has a number of brittle stars that have come out of these sponges. Some of them house lots and lots of little pistol shrimp, etc. But they're just an amazing amount of shapes that they can take. And the same sponge may have several different shapes depending on the water current in the area. Sometimes they might make a nice tube sponge, like this one over here. And then it might also grow in a encrusting layer over shells or soft corals or just the hard bottom. And so it depends a lot on the water currents, the shape that the sponge takes. And so sponges are really, really, really hard to identify because they can be so many different shapes, and they can be found in lots of differing kinds of current situations. There are some that we have here in northern Florida that have a few constant things that are typical of that species of sponge. For instance, we have this little orange ball sponge, or sometimes it's called an orange golf ball sponge, and it has a close cousin, the yellow ball sponge, which is, oh, there it is. Okay, and these have a real spherical shape virtually all the time. So we might find an orange encrusting sponge at some point in time, and if we send it off to our taxonomists who study sponges in this area, they might come back that it was the same as the orange ball sponge. It's just, once again, they have different environments and different current situations, and that causes them to take on different shapes. Now, one of the most fun things about the sponges is that they're colorful. You know, a lot of stuff in the ocean just is kind of drab, and unless you happen to be on a coral reef, you know, you'll see brown fish, kind of greenish fish. You'll see green algae and brown algae, and occasionally a red algae that's kind of a deeper brownish red color. But sponges are absolutely brilliantly colored, oftentimes, like this beautiful orange sponge, this little purple sponge. We have an orange finger sponge over here and a yellow finger sponge. We use these a lot in displays in the aquarium area. And that's because they're really quite beautiful because they're so colorful. Now, sponges all have a skeleton that helps support them, and they really don't have much else when it comes to things we're thinking of as internally in most animals. There are no mouths, there's no blood, there's no heart, there's no brain, there's no stomach. There's none of those things that we're used to finding in animals. These are basically just cells. Individual cells take care of all of those functions. And a lot of stuff diffuses right in and out of the cell. And the fact that they have all these channels, which keeps them in close contact, the whole body of the sponge in close contact with the water, allows for that movement of oxygen and food and waste products and all of that stuff going back and forth in the water. But there aren't any organs that take care of that. They don't have those specialized tissues. In fact, the most specialized thing in a sponge is what we call a collar cell. And it's a little cell that has it looks like a collar around one end of the cell. It's just a little tube that opens up. And inside that collar is a single flagella, a little whip-like organelle that twirls. And when it twirls, it works just like an impeller. An impeller is like a backwards propeller. It pulls water in instead of pushing water away. And so the collar cells inside the sponge pull the water in through all those tiny openings and then push it out through the bigger openings. Now, one of the sponges that people recognize most often is this beautiful sponge right here. And one of the reasons I want to talk about it is, we can move some of this other stuff for a minute. This is called a basket sponge. And you can see all this white live tissue on the outside. But over here you see an area where some of that live tissue has died, and what you see underneath there is the skeleton that's giving it its form and shape. And the skeleton can be composed of a number of things. All sponges have a protein that they make called spongin that makes up a large part of the sponge. And when you're looking at this basket sponge, what you see here in this spot where the tissue has died is the spongin part of the skeleton. Now, many sponges have tiny little splinters inside their bodies that help support that spongin protein. There may be little splinters of calcium carbonate, and those are called calcareous sponges. And they may be little splinters of glass that help to support the tissue. In fact, there are a number of sponges all around the world that are known as fire sponges, because if you tear into those sponges, you get what's like fiberglass, these tiny little glass splinters in your fingers, and they get embedded in there. You can't get them out, and it irritates the skin, and it gets all swollen and red and inflamed, and sometimes you even lose the skin in that area that got the little spicules, that's what those little splinters are called, embedded in there. Now, many of you know that sponges have been harvested around the world for for thousands of years, actually. But the sponges that we can use commercially, the sponges that you want to wash your car with, or the sponges that you want to put your makeup on with, those sponges have only the spongin protein as a part of their skeleton. And in Florida, we have a sponging industry that is based largely around this little sponge, which is called a sheep's wool sponge. And this skeleton is just the protein spongin. There aren't any other little splinter-like structures in its skeleton. And I'm just going to dip this in the water and show you. It's really absorbent, because all of those tiny little holes fill up with water. Okay, and this is what you might want to wash your car with. Or some of you might have painted walls and used sponge to give it a really textured effect. And that's once again because of kind of the rough exterior structure of the sponge. And this is just that protein. This is another sponge that is collected in Florida. This is called a yellow sponge. I've never seen this one alive. These, when they're alive, are black, black, black. They're just absolutely jet black. And when the spongers collect these sponges, they take a knife and cut off about 2/3 of the growing sponge. They want to leave a bunch behind on the rock or the shell or whatever the sponge has settled on, because they have to settle on something hard. And that way, when they come back in a couple of years, a new sponge will have grown. So they try really hard to make sure they don't collect more than they should of the live sponge. And sponges are really good at regenerating. And in fact, sponges have a really unique property that if you've been to college, you may have had to do labs concerning this, but sponges are sometimes said, well, not sometimes, they're said to be totipotent. What a great big word, okay? Go home, tell mom and dad, I really learned something today. Do you know what totipotent is? Totipotent means that the cells in the sponge are not really specialized. And so those cells can change into other kinds of cells. Like you can take a cell like that collar cell, and if you take that sponge and you put it through a sieve, and all of the cells get separated from one another, and you put your sieved little lump of sponge cells in the bottom, when you come back in a couple of days, it will have reformed into a new sponge. And it's not because all the collar cells moved It's because the sponges change, or the cells in the sponge change their function. Some of them are amoeboid and move back and forth between the outside of the sponge and those little channels on the inside. Some have changed into collar cells. Some are cells that help protect the exterior of the sponge. So they're kind of like an animal that has all stem cells. Those of you who've taken a lot of science and you know that stem cells are undifferentiated. They don't have a set function. Then sponge cells are just like that, all of them, throughout their entire life. They don't have a set function. Okay, now I just kind of wanted to highlight this one other sponge over here, which in our area gets this beautiful sulfur yellow color. I'm going to move this over here where I think we have a little more light, and maybe you can see it a little better. This is called, the scientific name is Ceola. It's a boring sponge. I know you thought all sponges were boring. They don't have a heart, they don't have a brain, they just sit there, they don't move, they don't respond. And in some ways they are all boring. But this one actually bores into limestone. Either the limestone of shells, that's what they usually attack, or if there's a limestone outcrop, they can bore right into the limestone of the rocky substrate. And they do that by secreting an acid. And then the cells of the sponge can live down inside this hard calcium material, and only the little excurrent openings, the oscula, appear at the surface of the calcium carbonate. Now, as they grow, then once they've taken over that calcium carbonate, then you get a thicker layer of the sponge on the outside, and that's what you see here. Is this has gotten, I'm not real sure what it was on originally. It's so covered up, it's hard to tell. But it ate right into whatever calcium carbonate was there originally, and then it took over, and now it has a nice thick layer of tissue. We pulled this shell because if you look at this shell, you can see tiny, 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 tiny little holes in the shell that indicate that's where the sponge used to be. And this is an oyster shell. Ceola, the boring sponge, is real problematic on oyster reefs, because once the shell is infected and it's creating these little holes throughout the shell is really weakened, so that other predators like stone crabs or red drum or any of those other things that love oysters besides humans can crunch the shell, and it just breaks apart much more easily than it would have if it did not have the sponge living inside the shell of the oyster. Okay, Miss Allison, have we got any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Can you go through what sponges that we usually find out here at Alligator Point?
Yeah, I will be happy to do that. We have Ceola, the boring sponge, that we find fairly frequently, and this washes up on the beach all the time. We have red beard sponge. Is that this one, Allison? Yeah, this is another one that we get fairly frequently that can wash up on our beaches. We do get little basket sponges that wash up on occasion. We'll get these tubular sponges like this one. In fact, I saw 3 of these on the beach this morning. We get these finger sponges, like this yellow finger sponge and this orange finger sponge. We sometimes, I've seen on the beach, these little ball sponges. So those are the ones that I see most often washing up on our beach. Now, you want to be really careful if you try and take home a sponge from the beach, because you're going to want to make sure that all the living tissue is dead and gone, like on this little specimen here. This one's nice and dried. You don't see any live tissue on there, because if you take one home that still has living tissue on it, it is going to run you right out of the house. It smells so bad, and it doesn't take long. Okay, you leave it in the trunk of your car, you're gonna go, oh, what was I thinking? Because, you know, it's summertime, you open up the trunk and go, oh my gosh, I should have never picked up that sponge. But yeah, these are frequently washed in because sometimes they may attach to just a shell, and once they've gotten fairly big, the where they attached to that little shell initially may not be enough to hold them onto the bottom, so that in a heavy storm they get washed in. And so frequently our beaches are littered with little sponge skeletons.
Okay, we have some questions here. Ruth asked, what's the difference between sponges and coral? Some of these sponges look a lot like coral.
They do, and certainly on a coral reef, oftentimes you think a coral reef has lots of sponges as well, but sponges are much simpler than corals. Corals have actual tissues, and they have little functional units that we call polyps with tentacles. They have a very specialized cell for stinging plankton and other prey that may be trying to hurt them, or that they are trying to find food. And also corals oftentimes have a little algae that lives inside them that makes them colorful. Like the little algae has green or orange or yellowy pigment and may give the coral a beautiful color, very much like the sponge. But the corals are much more complex, active predators. They have nerves. Some of them have muscle bands. So much still primitive, but not quite as primitive as the sponges.
Do you want to tell the audience how we feed our sponges?
Sure, I'd love to tell them that.
It's almost time to feed them.
We feed sponges kind of a seafood smoothie. We take fish, or sometimes fish roe, shrimp shells, shrimp heads, things that are kind of left over from feeding the other organisms. We cut it up into little pieces and we put it in a blender with some water, and we just blend the heck out of it. And then you can take a turkey baster and put it directly on the sponge itself, and it will suck in, using those little collar cells to create a current. It'll suck in all of that nutrient material. And the seafood smoothies are probably a really good food because it doesn't have to have, you don't have to have a whole cell, you don't have to have just these big molecules that are left over from the fish being blended up are exactly what the sponge wants to eat.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Monica asks, are any sponges endangered?
Oh, now there's a good question. I don't know if any sponges are endangered. I have a feeling that probably there are sponges where a lot of habitat loss has occurred that are endangered, but I don't think they're probably studied much. Okay, this is not a big active area of scientific research. There have been some that have been studied for to see if they have antibacterial properties or carcinogenic properties, but there's a ton that we don't know about sponges.
Are they edible?
Well, if you're a Hawksbill sea turtle, they're edible. Angelfish eat them. Some nudibranchs eat them, but most humans do not eat them. And I mean, I don't know of any humans that eat them. And I think that's largely because of this is a really tough protein, okay? To try and bite through that and successfully get it down your throat, it would be really tough. And add to this some of those little calcium or glass splinters. Yeah, you don't want to get those glass splinters all through your tongue and your gums. And yeah, I don't know of a single sponge that's eaten by humans. But apparently hawksbill turtles and angelfish love them.
Okay, Morgan Kate Fox asks, if you see sponges on the beach, should you throw them back into the water?
You know, I am a big advocate of throwing things back in the water, but the truth of the matter is, once sponges are out of the water, even for a very brief period of time, they usually die because they are so dependent on having a continual supply of water into all their tissues. In fact, as we were setting up for this live stream, we kept adding more and more water, because if you leave even a part of the sponge out of the water for any period of time at all, then that tissue begins, or I say tissue, but those cells, it's not true tissue, those cells begin to die. And so I probably would not waste my time anymore throwing them back into the water.
How do you tell if they're alive or not?
Well, once they're washed up on the beach, they're not going to be alive long, okay? They really are not. If you see them in the water, you know, they have you can tell by looking at the surface that you've got tissue over the skeleton, and that's going to tell you that that organism is alive. Like, you can see all this white tissue over these little areas where the tissue has died away. Once again, I shouldn't be using the word tissue because that implies that there are a couple of specialized cells in there, but and these are not quite at that level of development, but I can't think of another word that would really describe that. If they've got good color, then usually they're alive.
Okay. Are there freshwater sponges?
There are some freshwater sponges. There are not many of them, but there are a couple of freshwater sponges.
So are they like coral, where they prefer tropical warmer waters, or they don't have preferences?
Well, I think a lot of the ones that we are used to seeing are from tropical waters, but there are a lot of also deep sea sponges, huge areas with lots of deep sea sponges, and that's, you know, in cold, dark water. So I wouldn't say just tropical. You find them all the way. Sponges are found in all the seas, including the Arctic and Antarctic seas. So.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Jenny Bates asks, do they have a preference of moving or still water, or do they not care?
Moving water is always better, because if you, they need water moving through their tissues. So although there are some that tolerate more stagnant water, usually, for instance, in a pool or lagoon where you don't have much water movement, you're not going to find many sponges. They really need some water moving.
Okay, should you pick up sponges when you see them on the beach? Are they poisonous?
Well, they're not going to be, first of all, you know, when we use the word poisonous, that means if you eat it, it will kill you. But they don't produce venom much either, that I know of, and but those little splinter-like parts of their skeleton can be a problem, because if you get that in your hands, it can be uncomfortable, and it can make you uncomfortable for several days. So I would be a little careful. You know, if you're wearing gloves, you could probably pick them up without any problem, but if you're just barehanded, you might want to think twice before you pick it up. And also, you know, once it's on the beach, it's going to be dying. So it may be slimy and smelly and not pleasant to pick up.
Okay, before we end this live stream, can you talk a little bit more about that brain-looking coral?
Yes, this is a coral. We looked this up this morning. This is called Ceola, and it's a group of sponges that are known for their really dense glass skeletons. And there are lots and lots of little glass spicules in here. In fact, Allison picked this up earlier this morning and ended up getting little tiny splinters of glass in her fingers. But I love this sponge because it's one of the few sponges where you have all these tiny little openings, the ostia all over it, but the oscula, the ones where the water is coming out, are clustered together to make these like little regions, okay? And these are visible even in the live sponge, these little areas where the oscula are clustered. So you have lots and lots of little channels feeding into these clusters of oscula. And these are found in Florida. I think this one was probably found in Florida. I was given this sponge by somebody in South Florida, and so I'm assuming that they probably collected it locally, but I don't know that for sure. But I know there are other members of this family that are found even in the northern Gulf, so in Florida waters.
Okay, one last question before we end. Blair with Witherington asks, have there been any sponge die-offs in your region?
You know, I don't know of any sponge die-offs, and there are, we still have a sponging industry in Florida. Around Tarpon Springs, they sponge for sheep's wool and yellow sponges. And I understand that very close to home, right around St. Mark's, we used to have people sponging in that area as well. And so because we have people in the water